What happens when the internet vanishes? Not because of a glitch, not because of a cyber attack, but because the ocean floor moved. In just 73 seconds, the Kamchatka earthquake silently severed the world's most vital arteries, the undersea cables that power your life. You didn't hear it, you didn't see it. But suddenly, your screen froze. Your payment failed, and no one knew why. It began deep beneath the Pacific Ocean on a still March night. The tremors lasted less than 2 minutes. But as the seafloor cracked open and tectonic plates violently shifted, an even more fragile system snapped. Fiber-optic cables that carry the internet across continents. These cables, thinner than a garden hose but thousands of miles long, form the nervous system of the modern world. Without them, your texts don't send, your bank transactions stall, your navigation apps can't update, and businesses can't reach each other. And when the Kamchatka quake struck, dozens of them went dark. The first signs of trouble didn't come from sirens or emergency broadcasts. They came from frozen screens and unanswered support tickets. Why is our upload speed crawling? Is the site down? Why can't I log in? Within hours, engineers in Tokyo, San Francisco, Singapore, and Sydney began tracing the issue, not to their servers, but to the sea. Kamchatka sits at a digital crossroads. Several critical undersea cables converge near the peninsula, linking Asia to North America and connecting Russia's Far East to its western territories. The region is ideal for laying infrastructure, low marine traffic, low interference. But when the Earth shifted, the very trait that made it optimal made it vulnerable. By dawn, 3 major trans-Pacific cables were either severed or significantly damaged. The Asia-America Gateway, AAG, connecting Southeast Asia to California, saw severe signal degradation. Japan's high-speed Jupiter cable lost functionality across 2 major segments. Russia's domestic grid went dark across key Arctic cities and logging regions, cutting off not just data, but entire workflows. This wasn't just a tech problem, it was a global slowdown. When undersea cables fail, the world reroutes. But rerouting isn't instant. It causes drag, delays, and in many places, complete disconnection. Internet exchange points in Seoul and Hong Kong began clocking abnormal packet loss. Sydney's financial hub reported latency spikes in currency trading systems. In the US, eastbound video calls from California stuttered, dropped, or never connected. In a single morning, the fragile fabric of international data collapsed into a patchwork of sluggish pathways and fragile backups. Amazon Web Services rerouted internal traffic between zones. Google's search crawlers began to miss scheduled updates from East Asian news sites. Cloudflare reported a 19% spike in global latency. And online users, millions of them, had no idea why everything felt slower. Kamchatka's quake was unique, not just in magnitude, but in impact. Most quakes hit land or shallow coastal zones. This one reached deep under the ocean and shifted it vertically, ripping anchored cable sections loose, exposing once buried strands to raw pressure and debris. In some places, the cables snapped clean. In others, the fibers bent so sharply that signal degradation mimicked a full outage. As the hours passed, nations scrambled to assess. Japan and South Korea activated their submarine repair protocols, dispatching ships equipped with deep-sea cable grapplers. Russia, juggling domestic crises, struggled to coordinate offshore recovery, while power grids inland flickered from secondary quake stress. The United States, through its private tech firms, prioritized digital rerouting, but all efforts were reactive, not preventative. Satellite backup links provided minimal relief. While Starlink and other providers offered emergency support, they lacked the bandwidth to fully replace broken fiber systems. Enterprise clients fared better than residential users, but entire regions, especially in eastern Russia, parts of rural China and the Pacific Islands, were cut off from real-time connectivity. And with no connection, there was no communication. Banks couldn't verify international wire transfers. Cargo ports couldn't process digital manifests. Air traffic control systems on the fringes of Russia and the North Pacific switched to manual protocol, using radio relays instead of automated data channels. Telehealth appointments were cancelled. Cloud-based classroom systems failed to load. Thousands of students were locked out of online tests, all from one crack in the ocean. Kamchatka didn't need to flatten cities to cause a global emergency. It simply needed to tug the wrong line beneath the sea. And in doing so, it exposed a truth the world has long ignored. our digital lives are not wireless. They're tied to the seabed, anchored in places we never think about, held together by threads we never see. And when those threads snap, the silence that follows is not loud. It's subtle, slow. It feels like a loading bar that never finishes, a call that never connects, a backup that never completes. Until you realize, the earthquake didn't just shake the Earth. It shook the very system we depend on to exist in the 21st century. The quake struck at 2:46 a.m. Kamchatka time, but its digital aftershocks were just beginning. Across the globe, systems built on speed, efficiency, and interconnection began to fray. Every second, a signal couldn't get through. Every packet that was dropped, every rerouted request added invisible pressure to a digital world already stretched thin. In the minutes following the rupture of key undersea cables, data centers began to fail over into backup protocols. These systems are built to handle outages, temporarily. But when the outages aren't isolated, and when the origin is thousands of feet below the sea, even the most robust networks begin to show cracks. Engineers in Palo Alto began noticing latency abnormalities not just in Asia-facing services, but in domestic load balancing as well. A video uploaded in Tokyo took 3 times longer to appear in a New York feed. Network jitter affected stock trading microservices. DNS resolution for critical global apps experienced a measurable delay. By the time most consumers in the US woke up, the news hadn't even hit headlines. But the internet they logged into was already slower, spottier, and more fragile than the night before. Kamchatka sits at a junction point in the Eastern Hemisphere. Its undersea cable density isn't as high as the choke points of Singapore or the North Atlantic, but what it does carry is high priority. Data traveling from Shanghai to Los Angeles, from Seoul to Vancouver, and from Moscow's eastern territories to Europe often pings off systems that depend on cable segments near Kamchatka's shelf. The quake severed 3 of those, one of them the primary backup. That redundancy should have been enough. In theory, it was. But theory didn't factor in timing. 2 of the affected cables were already undergoing maintenance delays from previous seasonal undersea shifts, an increasingly common phenomenon as ocean temperatures rise and tectonic pressure builds. The 3rd was carrying double its intended traffic during a reroute from last quarter's repairs in the Okinawa segment. When the quake hit, those 3 became bottlenecks. And then, dead zones. The global internet does not collapse in a flash. It fragments. In New Delhi, latency to AWS Asia Pacific East surged to 240 milliseconds. In Jakarta, YouTube playback failed for thousands. In California, voice assistant response times doubled. In New Zealand, gamers saw server ping spike to unplayable levels. And in rural Alaska, where some schools rely on connections routed through the North Pacific, online classes went dark entirely. Government agencies responded slowly. Russia's Ministry of Digital Development released a vague statement noting technical interruptions across eastern sectors. Japan's MIC activated its national cyber emergency framework, though it wasn't a cyber attack. South Korea's Ministry of Science called for a review of submarine cable placement and redundancy strategies. In the US, the Department of Homeland Security held internal briefings with major telecom providers, but public communication lagged. Much of the world still doesn't know what happened that morning, that a continent-spanning outage was caused not by hackers or solar flares, but by the sudden vertical displacement of rock below the Pacific. The financial cost was staggering, even in the first 24 hours. Data-dependent industries, finance, logistics, healthcare, media, ran on backup capacity. Amazon's East Asia regional latency led to tens of thousands of delayed order confirmations. Media firms lost real-time collaboration between editorial teams. Ad exchanges missed bids. Streaming services suffered reduced resolution and more buffering, prompting spikes in unsubscribe requests. The intangibles were worse. Trust in digital infrastructure took a quiet hit. Some assumed service providers had failed. Others feared cyber warfare. Misinformation spread on Telegram, WeChat, and Reddit. Conspiracy theories about intentional cable cuts, secret drills, or tech company failures. The truth was much simpler and more terrifying. No one controls the ground beneath the sea. The effects trickled outward. A banking firm in London failed to execute trade confirmation batches with its Hong Kong office. A biotech company in Boston delayed a real-time genetic sequence pipeline from Seoul. A digital art platform in Berlin had to shut down its NFT minting protocol due to timestamp inconsistencies in cross-region blockchain nodes. These weren't crashes, they were drag, friction, invisible inefficiencies that cost millions before the cause was even named. All of it came back to cables. Long, silent, buried cables that no one thinks about until they break. Repairing them isn't quick. Specialized ships must locate the damaged sections, often using signal triangulation and sonar mapping. Robotic submersibles dive to depths of 3,000, 6,000 meters to retrieve the cables. They are brought to the surface, cleaned, respliced with protective enclosures, and gently remade. But the process takes days, sometimes weeks, and during that time the world limps along. Data takes longer routes, around Africa through European interchanges, bouncing off satellites not designed to handle volume. Prices rise, patience thins, everyone blames the cloud, or their router, or their app. But the real culprit lies silent in the dark, shattered by the planet that gave us life, and now reminds us how vulnerable that life remains. Kamchatka taught us something few wanted to hear. In a digital world, the most analog thing, an earthquake, can still bring everything to a crawl. The damage caused by the Kamchatka earthquake to the undersea cable networks was not just a technical event, it was a geopolitical wake-up call. While fiber-optic cables physically lie on the seabed, their ownership, control and repair cross into deeply political territory. What was once viewed as neutral infrastructure suddenly became a matter of national security. In the immediate aftermath, coordination to assess and repair the damaged cable segments became entangled in international tension. Russia, already managing an enormous internal disaster response, was reluctant to allow foreign cable repair vessels into its exclusive economic zone, EEZ. The region's maritime boundaries are tightly controlled, especially near sensitive military areas. Japan's state-backed repair vessel Subaru Maru was reportedly held outside the designated zone for over 18 hours before approval was granted to survey one of the severed cables. China, meanwhile, used the incident to amplify its calls for a sovereign internet structure, reinforcing its Great Firewall narrative that global dependencies are weaknesses. State-run media emphasized how vulnerable China would be if it had allowed more of its digital infrastructure to rely on foreign-controlled cables. Beijing's Ministry of Industry and Information Technology released a statement within 48 hours calling for regional cable autonomy and a re-evaluation of global internet reliance. The United States and its big tech firms were not silent either. A closed-door emergency forum convened between representatives from Google, Meta, Amazon and Microsoft, along with the National Security Council and the Department of Commerce. One official brief noted that the disruption posed an unacceptable exposure of trans-Pacific data infrastructure. What was once a shared ecosystem became a contested space, because data isn't just a service, it's power. The Kamchatka rupture revealed how few of the undersea cables are truly multilateral. Most are built and funded by a coalition of private companies and national telecoms, meaning repair and access rights depend on diplomatic standing. In cases like this one, cooperation isn't guaranteed, and when speed is essential, bureaucracy becomes a threat. Simultaneously, the incident triggered renewed cyber warfare speculation. Was the Kamchatka quake truly natural? Online forums, especially in Russia, India and parts of Eastern Europe, buzzed with claims that this was a covert cable sabotage disguised as seismic activity. Geologists and satellite data quickly refuted those claims, but the fact that such narratives gained traction shows how fragile public trust in digital stability has become. Even more pressing were the economic ramifications. Submarine cable insurance, a niche but crucial sector, saw rates spike overnight. Data-intensive firms began re-evaluating their routing strategies. Hedge funds began modeling seismic resilience indexes to forecast the probability of digital slowdowns in coastal nations with known tectonic vulnerabilities. These weren't conspiracy theorists. These were banks and infrastructure investors treating earthquakes as digital black swans. The academic sector also reacted swiftly. Papers submitted to journals like Nature Geoscience and IEEE Transactions on Communications began appearing with titles like Tectonic Risk Modeling for Submarine Infrastructure and Seismic Fault Crossings in Cable Path Design. University researchers warned that we had overbuilt on efficiency and underbuilt on resilience. Some proposed new routing strategies avoiding known subduction zones, while others urged diversification of data flows through satellite networks and terrestrial fiber. But none of these were overnight solutions. Real recovery takes time, and during that time, the human cost accumulated. Hospitals in far eastern Russia and parts of coastal Alaska reported delays in remote diagnostic imaging. Patients waiting on scans to be reviewed by out-of-region specialists had to be rescheduled or rerouted through slower backup systems. In Japan, an AI-assisted surgical scheduling program went offline for 13 hours, delaying hundreds of procedures. Remote education systems, especially in indigenous communities from the Sakha Republic to Nunavut, suffered days-long outages. In the Philippines and Micronesia, where some rural schools rely exclusively on satellite subsea broadband, entire campuses closed for the week. The students didn't know where Kamchatka was. They just knew the lessons didn't load. The outage even reached into financial aid. Banking verification systems used by NGOs distributing emergency relief funds failed to process cross-border transactions. A humanitarian grant designated for displaced families in Pacific Russia was delayed 4 days due to authentication timeouts from overseas banking APIs. These aren't just technical delays, they are human disruptions. And they show that when cables break, it's not the internet that collapses, it's trust. Trust in services, trust in governments, trust in the idea that a globally connected world can deliver even when something goes wrong. It raised a sobering question. If one quake in one peninsula can do all this, what would happen if 3 cables snapped at once in the Atlantic? What if the Taiwan Strait, one of the densest cable corridors in the world, experienced a similar event? Or if cyber-physical sabotage synchronized with a natural event to trigger maximum global downtime? Those are not sci-fi plots. They are real-world scenarios now being modeled in boardrooms, war rooms, and disaster planning centers. Kamchatka's rupture didn't just test our infrastructure, it tested our preparedness, and we failed. But the story doesn't end here, because now everyone is watching the cables. While global headlines gradually caught up to the significance of Kamchatka's digital disruption, the real battles moved underwater. The race to repair the snapped fiber-optic lifelines wasn't just about restoring speed, it was about proving control, reasserting sovereignty, and avoiding future chaos. What had started as a geological event now morphed into a geopolitical scramble beneath the waves. The world of undersea cable repair is niche, expensive, and slow. Only a few dozen specialized vessels exist globally that are capable of locating, retrieving, and resplicing broken cable systems. Many are privately owned, but some are contracted directly by governments or telecom consortiums. When Kamchatka's seabed tore, these ships were already on the move, some from Japan, others from Singapore, Norway, and even the US West Coast. The first major mission was led by the Japanese vessel Kizuna Maru, equipped with deep-sea ROVs, remotely operated vehicles, hydraulic winches, and pressure-rated splicing chambers. The team had to triangulate signal loss, identify the exact location of the rupture, and then descend over 3,500 meters into one of the most tectonically unstable regions of the planet. This wasn't just a cable fix, it was a descent into an earthquake's scar. Under normal conditions, a basic cable retrieval and splice takes 5 to 7 days. In Kamchatka, violent aftershocks made submersible operations unpredictable. Shifting sediment buried some segments deeper than sonar predicted. Sections had to be carefully lifted, brought aboard, analyzed for microfractures, then reinserted using new anchoring techniques to minimize re-breakage risk. While Japan focused on the Jupiter and PC-1 cables, Russia launched its own operation targeting domestic lines critical to military and civilian communication across Siberia. The Yantar, an intelligence-linked vessel known for deep-sea surveillance missions, was dispatched, raising international eyebrows. The US Naval Intelligence Division openly tracked its route, prompting speculation over dual-purpose missions. Was Russia fixing its cables or mapping others? This distrust wasn't new. Undersea cables have long been suspected targets in espionage and surveillance operations. The Kamchatka incident only heightened these fears. Western analysts noted that the damage gave all major players plausible reason to dispatch high-tech vessels into international waters under the guise of repairs. Paranoia surged that while cables were being fixed, others were being examined, tapped, or worse, mapped for future sabotage. The repair drama sparked heated debates at international telecom forums. Should the UN or ITU, International Telecommunication Union, be granted inspection rights over undersea cable operations? Should certain high-risk zones be declared cooperative repair areas free from national jurisdiction during crises? As usual, the discussions ended in deadlock. National interest outweighed digital cooperation. Meanwhile, tech firms grew restless. With multiple cables down and slow restoration timelines, companies like Amazon and Google began rerouting major traffic loads across less efficient terrestrial backups. Fiber corridors from Europe to Asia, via Turkey and Central Asia, became overtaxed. India's Mumbai gateway saw record latency as traffic to East Asia ballooned by 62%. South Africa's cable systems, already bottlenecked, failed to handle the overflow from rerouted Southern Hemisphere links. It wasn't just big business that suffered. Small content creators in Seoul, Jakarta and Manila reported 40 to 60% drops in ad revenue due to reduced Western traffic and lower stream quality. Crypto miners in Kazakhstan and Siberia were forced offline temporarily, unable to verify transactions in real time. Startups across East Asia lost potential investor calls, launch windows and marketing campaigns due to simple upload failures. For every billion-dollar firm with a backup plan, there were 1 million individuals without one. Perhaps most impacted were Pacific Island nations, those scattered across Micronesia, Polynesia and Melanesia. Many of them rely on single undersea cables for all their digital connectivity. When reroutes failed, entire countries slipped offline. In Tuvalu and Kiribati, government websites became inaccessible. Medical facilities lost access to cloud-based health records. Disaster coordination with Australia and New Zealand stalled. And in a bitter twist of irony, some of these islands also serve as emergency signal relays for submarine cable traffic between continents. Their disconnection meant fewer eyes and ears on the repair effort. Less redundancy, more risk. Kamchatka, in breaking these connections, reminded the world of two uncomfortable truths. First, that the internet is not truly global. It's a network of national decisions, private investments, and geopolitical permissions. And second, that the ocean is not empty space. It's a battlefield for control over the very arteries of the digital age. This realization hit Washington hard. A leaked internal memo from the US Department of Defense noted that if a localized event in a non-combat zone can cause global digital degradation, our strategic dependency on fixed subsea infrastructure must be reconsidered. In response, the Pentagon accelerated its hybrid communication initiatives, projects integrating low-orbit satellite systems with hardened terrestrial fiber and potential quantum communication backups. But such solutions are years away. For now, the world limps. News stories began trickling in. Why is the internet slower this week? Kamchatka quake, a digital black swan, but most consumers still didn't understand the full scale. They just noticed their streaming lagging, their meetings glitching, and their apps timing out. The real story remained below the surface, literally and figuratively. As repairs crawled forward and tensions rose, the world faced an unsettling realization. We are only as connected as the seabed allows. And right now, that seabed is angry, fragile, and full of secrets. The consequences of Kamchatka's seismic snap were no longer just about connectivity. They had become economic, political, and cultural. What began as a geological fracture now split across global confidence lines. Suddenly, everything that once felt seamless, streaming, trading, talking, was marked by fragility. By day 5, the technical response was stabilizing, but the economic aftershocks were still spreading. E-commerce platforms across Asia reported transaction declines of up to 18%. Payment gateways that depended on fast intercontinental API calls experienced timeout failures. This wasn't just a matter of inconvenience. Small businesses lost entire revenue cycles. Dropshippers in Vietnam couldn't fulfill US orders on time. Taiwanese manufacturers failed to confirm component shipments, causing ripple delays in Los Angeles and Mexico. In financial markets, it was worse. Automated trading systems thrive on milliseconds. With latency rising and data bottlenecks unpredictable, many firms voluntarily throttled their own algorithms. High-frequency traders paused activity across Asian exchanges. A hedge fund in Singapore posted a $4.3 million loss attributed to unverifiable latency-induced slippage. Even Wall Street noticed as trading volumes in tech sectors declined. Telecom giants were caught between bad press and limited options. Regional internet service providers fielded millions of complaints, especially from mobile users experiencing degraded app performance. Some Chinese netizens accused their ISPs of censorship rather than disruption. In Russia, state-run outlets initially downplayed the outage, attributing it to routine maintenance, until evidence of large-scale infrastructure failure leaked onto local platforms. Meanwhile, major American tech companies faced pressure to respond publicly. Google's brief statement mentioned submarine network degradation due to seismic activity, while Microsoft released a more technical report, indicating that cross-regional Azure latency remained within tolerance, but suboptimal. Neither comment satisfied users experiencing lag and loss of access. But the real response came quietly. Google, Amazon, and Meta began renegotiating bandwidth and fiber access deals in alternate corridors. Within a week, new routing bids were placed on infrastructure projects running through India, the Caucasus, and Africa. Private satellite backup contracts also saw a spike in interest, particularly for medium latency but reliable uplinks. In parallel, governments convened emergency telecommunications councils. The EU held a high-level summit on seismic resilience in digital infrastructure, warning member states to audit their submarine cable reliance. Australia announced a new regional fund to subsidise dual-path fibre routes for Pacific Islands. South Korea introduced a law mandating backup satellite access for national data centres. But all of this planning was retrospective. In the present, millions were still affected. Schools continued to cancel online tests. Hospitals rerouted telehealth calls. Court systems relying on video appearances missed hearings. Weather stations in the Arctic Circle couldn't update databases shared with international climate labs. Even dating apps saw a dip in user engagement, prompting algorithmic resets as location syncing failed. People felt it everywhere, even if they couldn't name it. And for those in the affected regions, Kamchatka, Magadan, Sakhalin, the damage was not digital, but real. Towns lost partial mobile coverage. Emergency broadcasts reverted to radio. Local news stations, many reliant on cloud production tools, aired outdated reports. Residents heard the quake and now lived in its digital shadow. One local station in Petropavlovsk-Kamchatsky broadcast a segment titled Invisible Damage, documenting how digital disconnection became social disconnection. Interviews showed families unable to reach relatives abroad, students afraid of missing deadlines, and shop owners cut off from their online POS systems. A baker said, "It's not the earthquake we fear, it's the silence after." The moment offered a deeper reflection. How much of modern life is real if it's all mediated through fragile, silent lines under the ocean? Academic researchers began pushing for a new field of study: seismic digital impact modeling. Merging earth sciences with data infrastructure, they aim to predict not just quake zones, but their potential digital dead zones. Some called for international seismic redundancy protocols, plans to kick in new digital routes based on earthquake forecasts and tectonic instability metrics. Insurance companies jumped in fast. Within 2 weeks, premiums on data center coverage, fiber infrastructure, and submarine cable routes jumped by 9 to 12%. Insurers added new clauses for tectonic latency loss, a term that didn't exist a month earlier. Tech startups began branding themselves as disaster resilient or edge first as a way to appeal to anxious investors. Even culturally, Kamchatka's impact lingered. It entered pop culture as a metaphor. A Kamchatka moment became a way to describe a sudden, invisible collapse. Memes joked about buffering screens and earthquake-proof Wi-Fi. But beneath the jokes, unease persisted. Because the real story wasn't that the internet slowed, it's that it cracked. Not completely, not catastrophically, but enough to make the world ask, what else could break? Kamchatka didn't destroy global connectivity, but it exposed how thin the thread really is, and how deep the silence runs when the digital tide pulls back. In the weeks after Kamchatka's ocean floor tore through the planet's digital skin, the world didn't collapse, but it blinked. And in that blink, we saw what had been invisible for years. That our lives, our economies, our relationships, and our safety now depend not on airwaves or satellites, but on thousands of miles of fragile fiber buried beneath shifting seas. For most people, life resumed. Videos loaded again. Messages went through, payments processed. But under the surface, everything had changed. Telecom firms revised their risk forecasts, governments started redrawing their infrastructure maps, engineers stopped assuming redundancy meant security, and citizens, millions of them, learned a new kind of fear. The fear that the world could disconnect, not from a war, not from a virus, but from the Earth itself. The Kamchatka event forced a reckoning. The idea that the internet is everywhere no longer feels comforting. It feels misleading. Because it's not everywhere. It's not in the sky. It's not magic. It runs along paths that can be cracked, drowned, shifted or severed. Paths that pass through choke points where no nation fully controls them. Paths that we barely protect, rarely understand and usually ignore until something goes wrong. In response, new alliances began forming. The US, Japan, Australia and India discussed joint cable development funds under the Quad framework. The European Union approved a digital seafloor initiative to co-invest in high-resilience cables along Atlantic and Indo-Pacific routes. Even private companies like SpaceX and Amazon's Project Kuiper accelerated their low-orbit internet deployments, not as replacements, but as a layer of safety. And yet, for all the solutions being proposed, the fundamental truth remains. We built a world that relies on connections we can't fully defend. We've engineered convenience but ignored consequence. And now we face an era where seismic shifts don't just move the ground, they shake the entire system. The lessons are sobering. First, redundancy must be reimagined. Having multiple cables routed through the same tectonic zone is not redundancy. It's a single point of failure with multiple wires. Second, transparency is essential. When cables fail, governments and companies must communicate clearly, quickly and honestly. Delayed explanations fuel misinformation and panic. Third, inclusion matters. Pacific Islands, Arctic towns and isolated communities must be prioritized, not just as users of global data, but as guardians of its continuity. Their visibility or lack of it defines how global the internet really is. And finally, resilience is not a luxury. It's the new baseline, because this won't be the last rupture. Tectonic activity is accelerating. Climate shifts are altering ocean currents, which stress cable placement. Geopolitical tensions continue to rise, and with them, the temptation to use critical infrastructure as leverage. The future isn't about avoiding disruption. It's about building a world that doesn't break when it happens. And perhaps most importantly, Kamchatka reminded us of something we lost along the way. Awe. We've grown used to living in a world that moves at light speed, where voices travel across oceans in milliseconds, and where a village in Alaska can video call a classroom in Tokyo. But all of it, every byte, every ping, every promise, relies on cables no thicker than your finger, threaded through an ocean that doesn't care what we built. This is not a call to panic, it's a call to prepare, to understand, to respect the forces we've learned to ride, but never to tame. And in the silence that followed Kamchatka's tremor, that message echoed louder than ever. If you found this story eye-opening, don't forget to subscribe to Crisis Lens. We uncover the invisible threads that hold the world together and what happens when they snap. From disasters to disruptions, we bring you the full picture. Subscribe now and stay one step ahead of tomorrow's crisis.